The frost clung to the wagon wheels like an old promise that winter had no intention of breaking. In the gray light before dawn, the town of Dry Creek held its breath, the silence broken only by the groan of timber and the faint rattle of a shutter in the wind. Beneath the freight wagon parked beside the feed store, a girl lay curled into herself, knees drawn tight, arms locked around them as though she could make her own body a shelter. Her shawl, thin, frayed, hardly more than a whisper of wool, did little to guard her from the bite of the cold. Every exhale left her in a pale plume, dissolving into the frozen air. She had been here since nightfall, listening to the creak of boards above her, the occasional clatter of hooves on the frozen street. Sleep had been a shallow thing, interrupted by shivers so sharp they woke her, and by dreams that turned to memories before she could stop them. In those dreams, there was still a home, a table with a lamp on it, voices softer than the wind. But Dry Creek was not a place for such comfort, not for a girl with no coin and no name the townsfolk cared to hear. Clara May Harwood had stepped off the freight wagon 2 nights ago with the cautious hope of finding work, maybe even a place to lay her head without looking over her shoulder. But hope was a fragile thing here. By the time the sun set on her first day, she had already felt the weight of sidelong glances and the press of whispered words behind her back. The liveryman had told her not to sleep in his hayloft, as if her presence alone might sour the grain. The hotel clerk had simply shaken his head before she'd finished her plea. A woman at the seamstress's shop had murmured to another, "Poor thing," but kept her eyes fixed on the hem she was stitching. Now, the cold was settling deep in her bones. She pressed her forehead to her knees and tried to make herself smaller, invisible to the dawn. That was when she heard it, the deliberate rhythm of boots on frozen earth. A shadow stretched across the hard-packed ground, stopping just short of the wagon. She tensed, her breath catching. Silas Boone was not a man who startled easily, nor one who wasted words. He had come into town early for supplies, his coat collar turned up against the wind, his hat brim casting his eyes in shadow. But even in shadow, those eyes were sharp, the kind that could pick out movement from 100 yards. He crouched, resting an arm over one knee, and met the girl's gaze without speaking. She looked back, wary as a cornered bird. "You'll freeze to death under there," he said finally, his voice low, the drawl softened by something gentler than pity. Clara shifted, inching back until the wagon's axle pressed against her spine. She had learned that sometimes kindness came with a price she couldn't afford. Silas reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a folded wool blanket, still holding the day's stored heat. He didn't push it toward her, just let it rest in his open palm. "Take it," he murmured. For a long moment, neither moved. Then her hand, thin, chapped, nails ragged, slipped from the shawl to the blanket. She gripped it quickly, pulling it tight around her shoulders as if afraid it might be taken back. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Before Silas could say more, another figure approached, her heels clicking sharp against the frozen street. Etta Lou Parson, the seamstress and unofficial keeper of the town's morals, stopped at the sight of the girl beneath the wagon and the man crouched beside her. "Silas Boone," she said, voice cutting through the cold like a blade. "You best not be meddling. That girl's bad news, came in on the freight wagon with nothing but a story no one believes." Silas didn't stand. His eyes didn't leave Clara's. "Cold don't care about gossip," he said, his tone mild but immovable. Etta Lou's mouth tightened. "Mark me, Boone, taken astray and you'll have the whole town sniffing after trouble." She cast a final look at Clara, the kind that stripped rather than clothed, then walked on, her skirt swaying like the punctuation on her words. Silas straightened slowly and extended a hand toward Clara. She hesitated, glancing toward where Etta Lou had gone, then back at him. His hand remained steady, patient. She slid her own into it, surprised by the warmth of his grip, the absence of force. He helped her to her feet, the blanket slipping slightly from her shoulders. "Come on," he said. "Feed store's warmer than this wagon bed." She followed, her steps small, the weight of the blanket around her shoulders holding her upright more than her own strength. As they reached the store's back door, Silas glanced at her just once, the corner of his mouth lifting almost imperceptibly, as though he saw past the dirt and cold to something she didn't yet believe she still carried. The door closed behind them, muting the wind, and for the first time in 2 nights, Clara felt the possibility, just the possibility, of warmth. She didn't yet trust it, but she couldn't quite turn away from it either. And somewhere in the spaces between their silence, the day began to shift. The little stove in the back of the feed store breathed out its dry heat in steady sighs, the scent of singed pine mingling with the sharper tang of burlap and grain. Silas Boone crouched before it, stirring the fire with a length of iron until the embers glowed like a bank of sleepy eyes. The girl sat nearby on a crate, the wool blanket still wrapped about her shoulders, her hair catching the firelight in uneven strands. She hadn't touched the tin cup of coffee he'd set on the counter. Her eyes followed the flames instead, as if trying to memorize their language. "You from far?" he asked without looking at her. She hesitated. "Far enough." Her voice was hoarse, shaped by cold and disuse. She looked down at her hands, raw knuckles, a crescent of dirt under each nail, then back to the fire. "My pa owed money. They came last spring, took everything that wasn't nailed down. Took him too." She said it flat, as if telling it without feeling might keep it from breaking her open again. Silas didn't ask who they were. He had known enough hard men to recognize the damage they left behind. Instead, he reached for a sack of feed, hefted it to the shelf, and let her keep her distance. By midday, word had traveled through town faster than the winter wind. Silas Boone was sheltering the Harwood girl. Some claimed she'd run from trouble elsewhere. Others muttered about theft, about curses that followed certain folk like a shadow. Marshal Jedrick Cole showed up before sundown. He was a man carved from the same weather as the land, slow-spoken, watchful. He stepped into the feed store, his boots grinding ice from the threshold, and tipped his hat toward Silas. "Boone," he said evenly. His eyes drifted to Clara, then back. "She's been sleeping under wagons. You know how it looks." Silas leaned a hip against the counter. "Looks like she needs a warm place more than your jail." Cole's gaze lingered on Clara. "Town's talking. You keep her here, it'll be on your head." Silas didn't answer right away. "I'll carry it, then," he said finally, his tone low but firm. The marshal studied him for a long moment, then pulled the door shut behind him without another word. That night, Silas let her climb to the loft above the store. The air was sharp up there, but it was dry and safe, the floor scattered with clean hay. He carried up a folded quilt from his wagon and laid it over her as she slept, careful not to wake her. Her hand, small and pale in the firelight's reach, curled around the edge of the quilt as though claiming it. In the morning, the missing button on that quilt had been sewn back on, the stitches a little uneven but strong. He noticed, though he didn't mention it, only tipped his hat when she passed by in the narrow aisle. For a few days, they found an easy rhythm. She swept the floor without being asked. He made certain the stove stayed fed. Their words were few, but there was something in the quiet that settled around them like the steady ticking of a clock. Then Tobias Cray pushed through the door. Cray was broad across the shoulders, his coat smelling of horse and stale tobacco. He slapped a glove against his palm, glaring at Silas before his gaze slid toward Clara. "You keeping her here?" Silas didn't move from where he stood. "She's not hurting anyone." "She's a stray," Cray said, his voice carrying the slow heat of a threat. "Strays bring trouble. Next thing, something turns up missing and you'll wish you listened to me." Silas's voice stayed calm. "If you've got proof, speak it. If not, you're just cold wind making noise." Cray's lip curled. "If the marshal won't deal with her, I will." He shoved the door open hard enough to rattle the glass and stomped out into the street. That night, Clara stepped out back to breathe in the cold air. She hadn't heard the boots behind her until the smell of tobacco reached her. Tobias Cray loomed in the dark, his breath clouding in the frigid air. "You best be gone by sunrise," he said, his words low and rough. Clara shook her head, backing toward the store, but his hand shot out, fingers clamping around her wrist. Pain jolted up her arm. She tried to pull away. A shadow moved in the dark. Silas's voice came from somewhere close, quiet but edged. "Let her go." Cray turned, still holding her. "This isn't your..." Silas stepped forward, his coat brushing her shoulder, his eyes unreadable under the brim of his hat. He took Cray's arm, pried it from Clara's wrist with slow, deliberate force. Cray jerked back, face flushing red. "You'll regret this, Boone," he spat, but the words fell flat in the space between them. Silas didn't answer. His hand settled on Clara's shoulder, steadying her as she caught her breath. He guided her back toward the store, his steps measured, unhurried. Inside, the lantern light was warm again, the stove still murmuring in the corner. Silas closed the door, the latch clicking softly into place. She stood there for a moment, looking at him, then let her fingers rest on his sleeve, light, tentative, before she pulled away. He reached past her, trimmed the lamp wick, and blew out the flame until the room sank into the gentle glow of the stove. She watched him cross the floor, the sound of his boots fading, and long after he had gone upstairs, she stood there, feeling the weight of the blanket still on her shoulders and the strange, steady knowledge that she was no longer entirely alone. Snow came to Dry Creek in slow, deliberate drifts, softening the hard lines of boardwalks and roof shingles. The first morning it lay clean across the street. Clara stood in the doorway of the feed store, her breath curling into the pale air. She was not shivering now. The wool blanket was folded neatly over a chair upstairs, replaced by a patched cardigan Silas had left for her without comment. She wore it as if it had always been hers. Days had begun to fold into one another with a quiet rhythm. She swept the floor each morning, pushing dust and husks into a neat pile by the door. She learned to weigh feed with a steady hand, to wrap brown paper parcels with string tight enough that they held their shape. She spoke more now, though still in the careful way of someone testing how far her voice could reach without stirring trouble. Silas listened when she spoke, not as a man humoring a stray, but as if her words were worth holding on to. The town, slow to shift its opinion, watched her from a cautious distance. When Etta Lou Parson first came back through the feed store's door, she found Clara behind the counter, tallying up a customer's flour order. Etta Lou's eyes narrowed, but she said only, "You're settling in." It wasn't approval, but it wasn't condemnation either. Clara nodded once, and something nodded in her chest. The marshal visited less often now. When he did, his words were fewer. One late afternoon, he paused at the threshold and spoke in a voice meant for Silas alone. "Cray won't trouble her again. Best you know, some men back down faster than they'll ever admit." Silas inclined his head. Clara didn't ask what was said, but she caught the flicker of relief that crossed his face. Evenings were her favorite. The store would grow still, save for the faint crackle of the stove and the occasional creak of timber. Sometimes she would sit on the porch steps, watching the sun's last fire spread over the hills until it sank into the earth. Silas would join her, sometimes with 2 mugs of coffee, sometimes with none. He rarely spoke first. One evening, she broke the silence. "I can leave, if you want." The words were quiet but certain, like she'd rehearsed them. Silas turned his head, considering her for a moment before answering. "You could," he said. "But you don't have to." Her lips curved faintly, the smallest smile she had worn since he'd found her. She didn't thank him. Instead, she leaned her shoulder briefly against his arm. The contact was gone in a heartbeat, but the warmth of it lingered longer. As winter deepened, she began to carry herself differently. Her steps were surer, her chin a fraction higher. When customers came in, she met their eyes instead of the floor. She even laughed once, soft, surprised, when Silas made an offhand remark about a stubborn mule in the next county. He didn't point it out. Some moments were better left to stand quietly. The coldest morning of the year arrived with a sky the color of pewter. Clara rose early, wrapped her scarf twice around her neck, and stepped outside to watch the snow gather on the wagon wheels by the hitching post. She thought of the night she'd first come here, curled beneath that same wagon, trying to make herself invisible. Now she stood in plain view, coffee in hand, her breath rising into the still air. Silas came up beside her, his boots whispering through the snow. He held out a second mug, the heat coiling between them as she took it. Their fingers brushed, a fleeting touch that seemed to hold more than the cold could erase. "Pretty morning," he said. She nodded, her gaze on the drifting snow. "It is." They stood there together, saying nothing more, the silence between them no longer heavy but companionable, like a well-worn quilt. And if you have ever been cold, cold in the way that seeps beyond your skin into the quietest chambers of your heart, you will know the weight of a small kindness given freely. You will know that sometimes a blanket laid over your shoulders is more than warmth, it is an invitation back into the world. And you might understand, as Clara May did, that belonging is not a gift someone hands you. It's something you grow into, day by day, until one morning you wake to find you are no longer hiding under wagons, but standing in the open, with someone beside you who will not let the wind take you alone.